This podcast is sponsored by Phaselaw. Picture this: a data subject access request has just landed on your desk. You've got 30 days to go through 40,000 documents across email, Slack, and 3 shared drives. And your review process is Adobe Acrobat and a lot of coffee. Sound familiar? That's the problem Phaselaw solves. It's the platform purpose-built for document disclosures, subject access requests, FOI, the lot. So instead of redacting PDFs one by one or forcing litigation software to do a job it wasn't designed for, with Phaselaw, you get collection, review, and redaction in one workflow built around the 1-month clock. Teams across EMEA are using it to cut response times from weeks to days. And for Guardians of Data listeners, Phaselaw is offering a 2-month free trial. Run it on live requests, see what it does to your backlog, and decide from there. No card, no commitment. Head to phase.law/guardians to claim your free trial. That's phase.law/guardians. Welcome to Guardians of Data, the show where we explore the world of information law and information governance, from privacy and AI to cybersecurity and freedom of information. I'm Ibrahim Hassan. In each episode, we speak with experts and practitioners to unpack the big issues shaping the IG profession. Think about the last time you walked down a busy street, sat in a pub, or queued for a train. Now imagine that moment, completely ordinary to you, being filmed by a stranger, uploaded to TikTok or YouTube, and watched by millions. Maybe it's monetized. Maybe it's mocked. One thing is for sure, it never disappears from the internet. Filming people in public has now become second nature for not just influencers and YouTubers, but ordinary people. Can you stop someone filming you in public? What rights do you have when the footage is published? In this episode, we explore what the law says, where it falls short, and how that affects real people who find themselves turned into content without consent. We'll also ask the harder questions about ethics, power, and whether the UK needs a new law to better protect the public. I'm joined by Naomi Matthews. Naomi is a lawyer and senior associate with Act Now Training. She's also a consultant solicitor at Richard Nelson's, where she specializes in data protection, surveillance law, and freedom of information. Here, she's speaking to us in her personal capacity, and of course, nothing she says should be taken as legal advice. Let's jump in. Welcome to the show, Naomi.
Hello, Ibrahim.
Naomi, when we were growing up in the 1970s, the idea of being filmed in public was completely different, wasn't it? Cameras weren't everywhere. If someone took a photograph of you, you knew about it. And more importantly, it didn't carry the risk of instant global exposure on the internet. How times have changed.
You're not kidding. I think back to when I was young, and I can remember going on holiday to a disco, known as a club these days, I think is the term. And in fact, I can remember the DJ shouting out that people who danced topless could get a mixtape, believe it or not. And people were voluntarily doing this. Now, I'm sure some people were fairly horrified the next morning, although they probably had a nice keepsake. But the thing that they didn't have to worry about was being filmed. So 30 years down the line, you don't have to worry about if somebody has put that up, if they're sharing it, if it comes back to haunt you in the past. And I often think to myself, in some ways, I think we were quite lucky growing up then and not now, because we don't have these sort of constant reminders being filmed, things going up. And all we have to worry about is now people filming us in our old age because they think that we are either funny or tragic. I don't know what you think, Ibrahim.
Yes, that's the real shift, isn't it? Today, anyone can film on their phone and upload it within seconds. Suddenly, the whole world knows your business. And even if you're just simply going about your lawful business, nothing particularly embarrassing, but we're of an age where we like to keep even our public life private. So recently I was shopping in my local Asian supermarket. They had a little stall outside. Somebody came from outside to sell fish. I was there innocently buying I think it was sea bass. And next thing you know, my wife gets a call from a friend saying, "Ooh, you're on the supermarket's WhatsApp channel. You were buying fish." She may have even mentioned sea bass. And I thought, something as innocent as that has suddenly now been shared with thousands of people on the supermarket's WhatsApp group. So it's fair to say that we are of an age where we're used to going about our business without people knowing. And these days, that's not possible, is it?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if I kind of think of a recent example, I went out to town and noticed that people weren't dancing. And I actually asked one of my sons, why is it that no one's dancing? And he actually said, because nobody wants to be filmed. And I thought, times really are changing. What we do is being affected by this constant reminder that we could be filmed at any moment.
Yeah, so it's sort of changing our behavior as well, isn't it? And these days, it's so easy because you might be able to spot somebody with a phone filming you, but what you can't spot is those glasses, Google Glass, which allow people to just film people without them knowing because it's just a pair of glasses or what seems to be an ordinary pair of glasses, which people can pick up from back in the day. Amazon was selling them for £1,500. Now they're as cheap as £500. So you don't even know it's happening.
Absolutely. I know some of them have got a light, which if you cover over means that they don't work. But the point is, it's very easy to be filmed, especially if you're not sort of au fait with that kind of technology and not realize that it's happening, which is obviously worrying because you can be having innocent conversations, having no idea that you're the unwitting star of a show.
Interestingly, I came across, and you may have seen this as well, on the BBC, cases involving a couple of women, one innocently on the beach sunbathing. Chap comes up to her wearing Google Glass, has a conversation, and then uploads that conversation onto his website where he is giving tips to men on how to pick up women.
Another shocking story that I saw this week on a slightly different subject, Ibrahim, was a photo fit that the police had put out. I don't know if you saw this at all, of a woman who was alleged to have defecated in a shop, believe it or not. And that had been put around by media outlets, including her full face and asking to ID her, and one wonders, is this even an offence? Is there any medical reasons behind this? Is it a case of mistaken identity? And it really makes you think about the issue of dignity and privacy and the fact that it just seems to be eroding at a substantial rate.
Yes, a few years ago, it was very much the case that individuals were doing this, but now that environment of constant filming and uploading footage has seeped into the public sector as well. So we frequently see footage of people being arrested. I mean, not just in the US with Tiger Woods just very recently, but also in the UK, body cam image, which we wouldn't normally come across. So there's almost like an expectation on the part of the public, which is feeding into the actions of public authorities, particularly police, in disclosing and publishing this footage, which previously was private, wasn't it?
Well, you've only got to look back to cases such as Cliff Richard when his house was searched by the police. You had BBC in helicopters above, and you probably remember he took a privacy case to court. And yet, fast forward to recent events, you've got the same kind of photograph and footage of Andrew Mountbatten, Mr. Mandelson. So it appears that not much is changing, really.
I'm glad you've mentioned Cliff Richard because there's been a number of cases involving celebrities, which I'd like to focus on. Because as lawyers, as privacy lawyers ourselves, we're interested to see if there's a legal solution. So let's start with the law in this area, or should I say laws. People often assume that there must be a clear law against being filmed without consent. Now, in some countries, there is, for example, Greece, South Korea. In the UAE, it's actually a criminal offense to take photos of people even whilst they're in public. But in the UK, there's no single law governing filming people in public and even uploading that footage on the internet.
Yeah, I think it's true to say that there is no one overarching law, but you've got clear human rights. One is freedom of expression, and the other is right to privacy, and neither trumps the other. And you could turn that on its head and say, would we want a starting position where we really couldn't film anything in public? We might want to film newsworthy stories. We might want to film a perpetrator who's committing a serious offence. There's lots of times where there is good public justification, if you like, for filming. So it's trying to work out what that right balance is. And I think that is why it's been quite difficult to have an overarching law that takes into account both those human rights, freedom of expression and right to privacy.
Yes, there's an important point that human rights aren't absolute. And when it comes to Article 8, the right to privacy, it is a qualified right, if I remember correctly. The interference with the right to privacy must be in accordance with the law in a democratic society where it's necessary in the interest of public safety, public order, health, and morals, or the rights and freedoms of others. So, first of all, it's a qualified right. And then, secondly, it's always balanced with freedom of expression. And that's what a lot of the cases are about involving police and other public authorities, particularly where journalists are being challenged. They always claim Article 10, the right to freedom of expression. I think that was one of the arguments in the Cliff Richard case as well. But just stepping back a little bit, on the face of it, if somebody came to you and said, I have a right to privacy, I was in a public place, somebody took a photograph, they published it on the internet, Article 8 applies, what would you say?
I'd say it's pretty difficult actually, because you have got this patchwork of laws. So you've got some criminal laws, but they tend to only cover photographs or film where they are filming something more intimate, and that is without consent, or it may be because they want to cause alarm or distress, something along those lines, or there is also some civil remedies, but you've got to take those to court yourself. And then, of course, there's data protection, but there's some issues there when it comes to trying to actually take a remedy. So I think a lot of time people are disappointed that there isn't a clear law that you can point them to that will give them the instant remedy, unless the specifics of that case involve something that encroaches into criminal law.
Absolutely. It's about where they were when they were being filmed and what they were doing. I remember the pet case where the chap was out in public. He was spotted on CCTV trying to commit suicide. The council CCTV recorded this. They managed to save his life, but also they also published that footage on the internet. The court ruled that yes, he had a right to privacy in a public place because he was doing almost a private thing or something that he was not in the right state of mind to consent to being filmed. But that's different to somebody just going about their normal business, going shopping or buying fish in my case, isn't it?
Mm. I mean, the thing about the pet case as well was that the CCTV images were held by a public authority. And I think part of the issue is, what about when a private person publishes that information? And we saw that law being developed in the case of Naomi Campbell's privacy case. That was where she was photographed leaving a meeting for Narcotics Anonymous. And it was whether, being a public figure and saying that she had not taken any drugs, she had a reasonable expectation of privacy. And that's what was argued by the newspaper in question.
Important case, and it goes back to what you were saying before, because the Mirror were also arguing, even if she had a right to privacy, they have a right to freedom of expression under Article 10. And there was a lot of discussion in the judgment with regards to that balance. Interesting in that case, because we ended up with a new tort of misuse of private information. So the courts used human rights to develop a brand new tort, some would say, akin to breach of confidence, but slightly different.
Well, what one of the judges said was that what human rights law had done effectively was to identify private information as something worth protecting, as an aspect of human autonomy and dignity, which I thought was a really good way to phrase it.
And since then, we've had the case of J.K. Rowling, famous author of Harry Potter. She used similar arguments in suing one of the newspapers, I believe it was the Express, for trying to publish a photograph of her on an Edinburgh street pushing a buggy with her child. And again, she was using the same kind of arguments, same kind of issues. So, very much it is about where you are, what you're doing, and the privacy of the information that's being disclosed. What about the law of data protection? Surely, Naomi, when somebody is being filmed, the filmer or the photographer is, of course, processing information about a living, identifiable individual. They're subject to the UK GDPR and all the rights and obligations that that contains. But could they argue that they're doing it for personal, domestic, or family reasons?
Well, if it's for domestic purposes, the UK GDPR doesn't apply, but there's quite a sort of a grey line between when you are still doing things for domestic purposes and when you would lose that exemption. And there's been case law about that, for example, where somebody puts things on a website or where they put it on a notice board and it was held not to be personal or household activity. And I think that definitely counts with things like Ring doorbells. You know, lots of people are always asking me, is my Ring doorbell, is that just domestic? And it might or it might not be. I mean, can you see into the neighbour's drive? Can you see past the curtilage of your own property? All sorts of questions, you know, when I put things on my Facebook or I put them on Instagram. Is that a personal blog or is that commercial? So it's not always 100% clear as to whether it will in fact stray past domestic, which will mean that the UK GDPR will apply.
I see. Now, there's clearly a difference between somebody who is filming or taking a photograph to share with their friends or their colleagues on their family WhatsApp group, perhaps. And then there are YouTube influencers, and there's people who have millions of followers on Instagram and Snapchat, etc. So recently I came across a YouTube channel that shows people driving through flooded roads. And then people comment as to the quality of people's driving and how silly or how safe they are, etc. And it racks up millions of views. So there's a difference between a YouTube influencer or a YouTube channel uploading photographs and videos and somebody doing it for their own family or relatives or a close friends group. So are they both subject to the UK GDPR?
Well, I think it's not only considering if it's domestic or not, so whether the UK GDPR bites at all, but there's also something called the journalistic exemption that allows journalists to set aside the usual rules where they want to use the personal information for a journalistic purpose, if it's done with a view to publication, and the publication would be in the public interest, and that if they did comply with all the UK GDPR's requirements, it would stop them from being effectively carrying out that journalistic purpose. So that's quite a big carve out, really. And the ICO have tried to make it clear in their code that that doesn't mean they can do anything. It's not a blanket exemption. They have to look at it on a case by case basis. But it's clear that it doesn't just apply to newspapers or magazines. It does apply to journalistic activity on social media potentially as well.
I remember recently on that point, Tommy Robinson, also known as Stephen Yaxley Lennon, quite famous right-wing commentator, was stopped at a port and the police asked for his PIN number to unlock his phone. He refused. He was prosecuted, but at trial, he successfully argued that the contents of his phone contained journalistic material and therefore he didn't have to give the PIN number and he was acquitted. So maybe the GDPR does give an exemption to some YouTube influencers and some commentators, but of course, as you mentioned, it doesn't give an exemption from everything. And clearly, they have to show some serious journalistic purpose as opposed to just commenting on the way people drive through flooded roads.
Well, I mean, the ICO says that they accept that citizen bloggers, as they call them, can invoke the journalism exemption if they're posting information or ideas for public consumption online, even if they're not professional journalists and they're not paid to do it. But many of them are because there is money incentives for views, clicks, etc. So it's clear that if you are doing what may be sort of journalism, and it could be just blogging, then it is possible that it may be covered by that journalist exemption.
Yeah, I think therein lies the problem, in that a lot of this legislation, when it was drafted, the internet wasn't the monster that it is now. And so the legislation is sometimes having to be retrofitted for the circumstances. So it's a difficult one. But of course, when GDPR does apply, then we know that there's the usual requirements for having a lawful basis, the transparency element, so people knowing what you're doing. And of course, people have rights to object. They have the right to ask for a copy of their data. They have the right, potentially, to exercise their right to erasure. So perhaps there is a way of using the GDPR to enforce rights against people who are filming you without consent. Would you say that's a fair summary?
Well, I think you're going to hate me, Ibrahim, because I'm going to say it depends again. And I think you can certainly make complaints to the ICO if you think your data isn't being processed in connection to the principles as outlined in the UK GDPR. But it doesn't mean that you're going to get the outcome that you want. And it may be that you've got to take your own civil proceedings to get the redress that you need. That may be what you have to do.
I agree. There is a remedy available within the legislation, civil action. Legal aid is not available, is it? So it would have to be privately funded, and it then depends on the resources available to the individual, how strongly they feel. Perhaps a complaint to the media channel might be more effective.
Well, there's certainly some good guidance on the internet about how to make complaints to each of the different social media outlets to try and get information taken down. I mean, obviously, it depends on what the content is, and that may well have a bearing on your complaint.
I see. Now, you mentioned previously the criminal law. We've seen a number of recent UK cases that really highlight the issues that we've been talking about, but it takes a more sinister turn. The so-called Manchester nightlife videos have been widely reported in the media. Entire accounts are dedicated to people filming women on nights out and then uploading onto YouTube for entertainment and profit. Is there a way that the criminal law can be used in these kind of nefarious or sinister cases to try and put a stop, or to try and get some remedy in this kind of situation?
Well, again, it depends on the content, and it depends as to what you consider, I think, to be nefarious. So, for example, some of the difficulty with the nightlife content was they were simply filming people going around about their everyday business, not particularly doing anything like upskirting. So therefore, the question is, was this any different from people who are just filming normally on night out? So if we look at the criminal law, it is evolving. But like everything, it's sort of struggling to keep up. But we can see that, for example, you've got things like the Protection from Harassment Act. If you think that you are being repeatedly filmed or followed, but it's got to be a course of conduct. It can't just be a single incident. And the defendant is effectively trying to cause alarm or distress. So that historically hasn't been very useful for the type of footage that you're talking about. I mean, and you have degrees. So, for example, I was talking to one of my criminal colleagues who said that, in fact, they had a particular person who was arrested for having numerous films, like 800, 900 films, and they were all of ladies in thick woolly tights. You know, where do you draw the line, Ibrahim? Is that the kind of matter that should be criminalised or should be penalised? You know, people have a variety of views on that, not to mention the kind of film that you were talking about in Manchester.
Yes, and I remember in the Manchester case, initially, Greater Manchester Police said that they arrested an individual on suspicion of stalking and harassment. But then in February this year, the force said that it would be taking no further action against the suspect because of, quote, limitations within the current legislative framework. So, what you mentioned before in terms of the kind of footage which is recorded and where the individuals were and whether there's a course of conduct in terms of harassment, that has an impact in terms of the availability of the criminal law, particularly the Protection from Harassment Act. Are there any other criminal sanctions that could potentially help in these kind of cases?
Well, there's several offences under the Sexual Offences Act 2003, and that has been updated quite recently. But traditionally, the offences of voyeurism were problematic because you had to tick all the elements before it could really bite. One particular case called Norcus, where a manager had asked an employee for their phone to install an app. And unfortunately, really unfortunately for the employee, some intimate films were uploaded onto the shop computer in error. Obviously, she was mortified and she asked the manager to remove them, and he assured her that they would be deleted. But when she went to charge her phone, she realised to her horror that they were still there. And eventually, the manager was arrested and they found that the films were also on his computer at home. But because the voyeurism offence was based on observation at the time, etc., etc., he was acquitted and they found that the offence wasn't made out. So there are definitely sort of problems with some of the offences, but I think the most recent additions have seen a whole string of offences where not all of them need to have components of observation or contemporaneously or alarm or distress or even sexual gratification. So, for example, there is now an offence simply of intentionally sharing a photograph or film which shows somebody in an intimate state where they don't consent and that they reasonably don't think that there is consent for that. So I think that certainly the law is trying to keep up with the changes, but I think, as you say rightly, it's a very difficult line to draw. You know, where do you draw the line? Upskirting is a separate offence. They talked about down blousing, breastfeeding, all sorts of issues, filming in public. And I think that with the gallop of technology, it's very difficult for them to keep up with all the offences that might occur. And also, at what line do you draw? Do we want to get to a state where everything is unlawful to record? You know, it's interesting because I've been sort of talking to various people this week, thinking about the issue and trying to understand, where does freedom of expression stop and right to privacy begin? And a lot of the young people that I've been speaking to, they feel like should be more about education, about understanding that you may be filmed in public and effectively being on your guard, knowing this technology exists, maybe having apps that detect covert technology, all of this kind of thing. And so it's very interesting. Often I think they think perhaps I'm too hung up on the idea of should we have privacy rights in public, etc. So I think it's really difficult to find that balance of both freedom of expression and rights of privacy. I think the criminal law tries to deal with the behaviour where there is intimate states, etc. But what point do you draw that line?
It is a very difficult line to draw. We don't want to live in a society where everything's banned or we take a very prudish approach to all filming. But at the same time, don't really want to live in a society where everything is being filmed in front of millions of people and then being the subject of ridicule. But I'm also interested to hear what you've said talking to young people with regards to the fact that they think the solution is education. And I'd agree, educating people to respect other people, not obviously women and girls and their privacy when they're on a night out. They want to enjoy themselves without lenses pointing at them, but they have a right to go about their lawful business. And I think that starts at an early age, starts at school in terms of safe use of cameras and phones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, another criminal case on voyeurism, which was Barone, was really interesting because it was about a young lady. She attended meetings, etc. She had a couple of drinks. She then took the train home. She'd put her feet up onto the bench and she actually fell asleep. When she got home, I think she was a bit worried the next day. So she actually requested a copy of the CCTV, probably as a subject access request. And when she got it, she was horrified to see that there was a gentleman who was taking photos of her as she slept. So the train company did an investigation and it transpired that it was actually an employee of the train company, that he'd taken several images of her private parts. But his defense was that she had a very short skirt on and that her pants were effectively on display. And although he had to be, if you like, in a special position, that he hadn't done anything untoward because he hadn't purposely upskirted. And the court didn't accept that and said the fact that he had put himself in a particular position and had, if you like, strived to get those pictures was enough for the offence. So I think that the criminal law is trying to deal with these issues, but certainly it may be that some of the film or some of the people, they might not even be based in Britain. And then that brings other complexities into play as well.
Recently, there was a story about a couple who had been on holiday abroad. It turned out that the hotel that they had used had hidden cameras, and their intimate relationship at night was actually broadcast live on some foreign channel, and people were paying to view. So, yes, the words are really, when it comes to the law, it depends. It depends where you are, what you're doing, the seriousness of the matter in terms of how the law views what you're filming and what's actually done with it. Stepping back, though, a little bit, Naomi, the law's fragmented, as we've discussed. Some would say it's even out of date and clearly not designed for the TikTok or the YouTube culture. Do you think we need a separate law governing this kind of filming and photographing activity, especially where it's without consent? Or would you say that it would create more problems than it's worth?
I don't really think it's for me to comment on trying to advocate for an overarching law. I genuinely think it is a difficult issue because I do genuinely think that freedom of expression and privacy are two very important rights. And therefore, I agree with some of the sentiment in some of those judgments where it says neither trumps the other. And it's that careful balancing act. And I think that young people increasingly are happy to be filmed sometimes. And I think it would be very, very difficult to have a law that could deal with all the nuances of what we have been talking about today. But I do think that the lawmakers have tried to keep up with the changes in technology, but this is such a complex area that it's difficult to come out with an overarching solution that would please everybody.
Naomi, it's been a fascinating conversation. We may well return to the subject at some point in the future, but for the moment, thank you very much for your time and your clear explanation of the law.
Thank you very much.
That's all for this episode of Guardians of Data. Once again, a huge thank you to Naomi Matthews. What is clear from our conversation is that there is no single law governing filming in public or posting those videos online. Instead, we are relying on a fragmented legal regime that leaves many people unprotected, struggling to understand their rights and facing barriers to justice, particularly where legal aid is not available. This isn't just a legal issue, though. It's a moral and ethical one. The law may permit filming, but it doesn't always protect dignity, context, or humanity in an online economy that rewards exposure and outrage. As social media continues to blur the boundaries between public and private life, the question isn't only what the law allows, but whether the law needs to change. If you want to dive deeper into the legal issues, there is a link to an article in the show's notes. If you found today's discussion useful, please subscribe, share this podcast with colleagues, and leave us a review. And remember, whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting out in information governance, there's always more to learn, and we'll be here to help you stay ahead of the curve. Thanks for listening, and join us next time on Guardians of Data. This podcast is sponsored by Phaselaw. Phaselaw is purpose-built for document disclosures like subject access requests and FOI requests. Instead of redacting PDFs one by one or forcing litigation software to do a job it wasn't designed for, with Phaselaw you get collection, review, and redaction in one workflow. Teams across the world are using it to cut response times from weeks to days. And for Guardians of Data listeners, Phaselaw is offering a 2-month free trial. Run it on live requests, see what it does to your backlog, decide from there. No card, no commitment. Head to phase.law/guardians to claim your free trial. That's phase.law/guardians.